What's the weirdest hill you've ever died on? My law professor assigned me to represent some kid in court over a ferret. I was failing trial advocacy, and this was my last chance to pass. Leo had found a ferret in a dumpster, but some rich guy claimed it was his championship ferret worth $10,000. I figured I'd show up, lose gracefully, and at least get participation points. The whole thing was ridiculous. I walked into the courtroom hungover in my borrowed suit with a folder full of Wikipedia printouts I'd compiled at 3 in the morning. Then I saw Leo, this skinny 12-year-old carefully holding a carrier and whispering to the ferret inside that everything would be okay. Across the aisle sat Walter Henderson, who looked like he owned several yachts, and his lawyer, who probably billed more per hour than my annual tuition. The lawyer was setting up an entire presentation about Mr. Slinky, a champion ferret with documentation tracking his bloodline back 14 generations. He had certificates, veterinary records, and sworn affidavits from something called the International Ferret Society. I looked at my Wikipedia printouts that said ferrets are domesticated polecats and felt like an idiot. But then Leo tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Mr. Slinky saved my life," and something in my chest tightened. I stood up and said Leo found the ferret in a dumpster eating pizza, which seemed like reasonable doubt to me. Henderson's lawyer pulled out security footage of something escaping from Henderson's mansion that might have been a ferret-shaped blur. He had an expert witness via Zoom, the world's leading ferret behavioral analyst, ready to testify. I wanted to laugh, but Leo was gripping my arm so tight it hurt. The lawyer showed photos of Mr. Slinky in a ferret mansion that probably cost more than my car. Leo started crying, and I found myself actually getting angry. This wasn't about a ferret anymore. It was about some rich asshole trying to take the only thing this kid cared about. I tried to object, but didn't know the right legal terms, so I just said, "That's not fair," and immediately felt like a child playing dress-up. Henderson's lawyer produced a genealogy chart showing Mr. Slinky was descended from the only ferret to survive the Titanic, which couldn't possibly be true but sounded impressive. I asked Leo to show how Mr. Slinky responded to his name, praying for a miracle. The ferret just sat there eating a banana chip, and my heart sank. But then Leo said quietly, "He only comes when he feels safe." Henderson stood up and started shouting about his precious baby, while Leo hugged the carrier tighter. The judge asked for actual proof this was the same ferret. Henderson's lawyer produced a DNA test, but I noticed it just said, "Ferret DNA confirmed," with no comparison sample. For the first time in law school, I actually felt smart pointing that out. The lawyer tried to show a birthmark, but Mr. Slinky wouldn't stop moving and definitely bit the lawyer's finger, which made Leo smile for the first time all day. The ferret behavioral analyst testified about Mr. Slinky unique war dance, but the Wi-Fi kept cutting out so it sounded like gibberish. Henderson's lawyer tried demonstrating the dance himself, hopping and spinning until he knocked over his presentation board. Ferret photos scattered everywhere, and when one landed on the judge's face showing a ferret in a tuxedo, I caught her trying not to smile. Maybe we had a chance. During recess, Henderson cornered us in the hallway and offered Leo $500, then $1,000. Leo said no and buried his face in the carrier. Henderson's lawyer started threatening criminal charges for possession of stolen ferret property. They said they'd make sure Leo could never adopt another animal. I wanted to punch them both, which wasn't very lawyer-like but felt entirely human. This kid had nothing, and they wanted to take away the one creature that loved him. Back in court, they announced new evidence, a social media post about a missing weasel. I pointed out ferrets weren't weasels, surprising myself by caring about the distinction. The judge looked exhausted, and I realized she probably had real cases waiting, but to Leo, this was the realest case in the world. I found myself standing taller, speaking louder, fighting for this ridiculous ferret like it mattered, because to Leo, it did. Henderson's lawyer pulled out a microchip scanner. Mr. Slinky was chipped. This will prove everything. He turned it on and moved it toward Mr. Slinky. My stomach dropped. The scanner started beeping. Leo gasped. Henderson smiled triumphantly, but then the scanner kept beeping at everything. The table, my phone, the judge's gavel. Henderson jumped up screaming, "That's my ferret, and I'll burn down every pet store in this city before I let that brat keep him." The judge's eyes went wide. "Mr. Henderson, did you just threaten arson in my courtroom?" Henderson's lawyer tried to do damage control. "Your Honor, my client is just emotional about his beloved pet. I know what I heard," the judge said. She looked at Leo, who was clutching Mr. Slinky's carrier and crying. Then at Henderson, red-faced and breathing hard. Then at me, standing there in my borrowed suit with my Wikipedia printouts, somehow ready to start throwing hands with everyone in this courtroom over a ferret. "I've made my decision," the judge said. She cleared her throat and leaned forward in her chair, making everyone in the courtroom go completely silent. "Mr. Henderson, your behavior today has been deeply concerning." Henderson's face went from red to purple, while his lawyer grabbed his arm and started whispering fast. The judge kept talking in that slow, careful way judges do when they're about to drop something big. "Threatening arson in my courtroom demonstrates you are currently unfit to care for any animal." Leo's hand grabbed mine, so tight I thought my fingers might break. "I am awarding temporary possession to the minor, pending a full evidentiary hearing in 3 weeks. Henderson shot up from his chair, but his lawyer yanked him back down before he could say anything that would make things worse. "Any further outbursts will result in contempt charges, Mr. Henderson." The gavel came down with a crack that made everyone jump. Leo was shaking next to me, and I realized we'd actually won something, even if it was just temporary. The bailiff started moving toward us to clear the courtroom, and Henderson's lawyer was already packing up his briefcase while trying to keep Henderson from exploding again. We walked out into the hallway, and Leo immediately wrapped his arms around the carrier, pressing his face against the metal bars. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," he kept saying over and over, while tears ran down his face. I stood there feeling completely lost because I knew this wasn't over, and I had no idea what came next. "Hey, we haven't actually won yet," I told him, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "This is just temporary until the real hearing." Leo looked up at me with those big eyes, and I found myself making a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. "I'll figure out how to do this right, okay?" He nodded and hugged the carrier tighter, while Mr. Slinky chittered inside, probably wondering why everyone was being so loud. That afternoon, I dragged myself to the law school clinic, still wearing my borrowed suit that now had ferret hair all over it. Kelly Foster was sitting behind a desk covered in case files, and she looked up when I knocked on the doorframe. I handed her my folder of Wikipedia printouts, reports and watched her flip through them with this expression like she was trying not to laugh or cry. "These are what you brought to court?" she asked, holding up a page about ferret digestion I'd printed at 3 in the morning. I nodded and she put the papers down, then pulled out a stack of actual legal forms from her desk drawer. "Okay, let's start with the basics of filing procedures." She spent the next 2 hours showing me how to fill out motions properly, where to put case numbers, how to format everything so the court would actually accept it. My hand cramped from taking notes, but I wrote down every single thing she said because Leo was counting on me. The next morning, I went to the courthouse clerk's office with my first real motion to file. The clerk, this older woman with glasses on a chain, looked at my paperwork and shook her head. "Wrong form, honey." She pulled out the right one and showed me which boxes to check, where to sign, how many copies I needed. I messed it up twice more before finally getting everything filed correctly, but when she stamped it with the official seal, I felt weirdly proud. 2 days later, we had to transfer Mr. Slinky to the municipal shelter for neutral custody, which meant taking him away from Leo. The shelter manager, Derek Hughes, met us at the front desk with a clipboard and started documenting everything about the ferret's condition. Leo was trying so hard not to cry while Derek weighed Mr. Slinky and checked his teeth and took photos from every angle. "I'll send you pictures every day," Derek promised when he saw Leo's face. We had to leave Mr. Slinky there in a special quarantine cage with a label that said, "Legal hold, do not adopt," and Leo cried the whole walk back to his apartment. That evening, I was eating leftover pizza when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Henderson's lawyer had filed an emergency motion claiming we were hiding the ferret and demanding immediate seizure for examination. My hands started shaking as I read through the motion on my laptop. I called Kelly Foster even though it was after 8 and she answered on the 3rd ring. "They can't just take him, right?" I asked, hearing my voice crack. She walked me through drafting a response, telling me which cases to cite and how to argue that the ferret was already in neutral custody. There's something strange about Henderson getting this worked up over a ferret that supposedly escaped from his mansion. If it really was his championship pet worth $10,000, wouldn't he have noticed it missing sooner than when some kid found it eating pizza? I stayed up until 2 in the morning getting it right, checking every citation 3 times. The next morning, I went to Leo's apartment to interview him properly about his time with Mr. Slinky. He showed me this notebook where he'd been tracking everything for 4 months. "He likes freeze-dried strawberries best," Leo said, flipping through pages covered in careful handwriting. "And he does this special dance when he's happy." There were drawings of Mr. Slinky sleeping in different positions, lists of games they played, notes about which toys he preferred. Later that day, I got a call from Leslie Reed at Leo's school. "I'm the designated counselor monitoring Leo's situation," he explained. "I can provide documentation showing his attendance improved 60% since he found that ferret." He offered to write a formal letter and gather Leo's grade reports. The next morning, a certified letter arrived at my apartment from Henderson's lawyer. They wanted the ferret back plus $5,000 in boarding costs, or they'd file a civil suit against Leo and his guardian. I stood there holding the letter, feeling my stomach drop. Part of me wanted to panic, but instead I went to the law library and pulled every animal custody case I could find. I sat there until midnight reading about possession laws and custody standards, taking notes until my eyes burned. Then my trial advocacy professor sent an email with the subject line, "Urgent academic warning," that made my chest tight before I even opened it. "You've missed 3 classes for this ferret case," it said. "1 more absence and you fail regardless of your final exam score." I stared at the email, realizing I had to figure out how to balance both things without dropping either one. 3 days later, I was sitting in the law library Googling random stuff about microchips when I typed in the exact model number from Henderson's scanner. The first result made me sit up straight. FDA recall notice from 6 months ago saying the ProScan 2000 gave false positives on anything metal within 3 feet. I clicked through 20 different government sites printing everything, the printer making this angry noise every 5th page, but I didn't care. The recall said these scanners would beep at car keys, phones, even aluminum foil, which explained why it went crazy on the judge's gavel. I felt my hands shaking as I organized the papers into a folder, checking the model number 5 times to make sure I had it right. Kelly Foster was going to flip when she saw this. The preliminary hearing came up faster than I expected, just 1 week later at 9 in the morning. I wore the same borrowed suit, but this time I'd actually prepared, had my folders organized by tabs and everything. Henderson showed up in what looked like a $1,000 suit, his lawyer wheeling in 2 boxes of documents on a cart. The judge looked at all of us and said she'd reviewed the emergency motions. Henderson's lawyer started talking about immediate return of property, but the judge cut him off. She said given Henderson's outburst at the last hearing, she was maintaining temporary custody with the shelter and setting a full evidentiary hearing for 3 weeks out. Henderson jumped up and his face went red, but his lawyer grabbed his arm and pulled him back down. They whispered back and forth for maybe 30 seconds before Henderson stood up and walked out, slamming the courtroom door so hard the bailiff stood up. His lawyer apologized to the court and asked for a brief recess to consult with his client, but the judge said we were done for today. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. After court, I went straight to Kelly Foster's office with the FDA reports about the scanner. She read through them and told me we needed to subpoena someone from the manufacturer to testify about the problems. I spent the afternoon tracking down contact info for ProScan Technologies until I found Aiden Russell, their technical compliance officer. When I called him and explained the situation, he sighed and said they'd been dealing with these recalls for months. He agreed to appear via deposition if we handled the scheduling properly. Kelly spent 2 hours teaching me how to conduct a deposition, making me practice the questions over and over until I stopped stumbling over the legal terms. She showed me how to mark exhibits and what objections to expect from Henderson's lawyer. The next morning, Leslie Reed called from Leo's school. His voice sounded tired when he told me Leo got suspended for 3 days after punching a kid who kept saying he should give the rich man back his ferret. Apparently, the other kid had seen something online about the case and wouldn't stop talking about it during lunch. Leo broke the kid's nose, and now the school wanted a meeting about his behavioral issues. Leslie and I spent an hour on the phone discussing how to help Leo without making things worse for our case. We decided Leslie would set up counseling sessions and document them as proactive steps to address Leo's stress. 2 days later, Derek Hughes called and invited us to observe Mr. Slinky at the shelter. When Leo and I arrived, Derek had set up this whole observation area with clipboards and forms. He had Leo sit on one side of the room while strangers came in on the other side. Mr. Slinky immediately ran to Leo's side of the cage, making these little chirping sounds I'd never heard before. When the strangers tried to pet him, he'd back away and hide in his tube, but with Leo, he'd climb right up his arm and sit on his shoulder. Derek wrote everything down in official shelter behavioral assessment forms, noting the timestamps and specific behaviors. He even took photos showing Mr. Slinky's body language with different people. The whole thing took 3 hours, but Derek said this kind of documentation could be crucial. I spent the next day trying to get security footage from Henderson's gated community. The HOA office was in this fancy building with marble floors, and a secretary who looked at my wrinkled shirt like it might contaminate her desk. She said I'd need a court order to access any community surveillance footage, then handed me a business card for their legal department. I went back to the law library and spent 3 hours researching how to draft a proper subpoena for surveillance footage. I must have rewritten it 6 times before it looked right, checking every citation and making sure I had the right statutory authority. When I finally filed it at the courthouse, the clerk actually said it looked professional, which felt better than any grade I'd gotten all semester. That weekend, everything exploded online. Henderson had joined 3 different neighborhood Facebook groups and started posting about the ferret thief and the crooked law student helping him. He'd somehow gotten a photo of Leo from the first hearing and posted it with a caption about teaching kids that stealing is wrong. My phone started buzzing with screenshots from random people who'd seen the posts. Kelly Foster met me at her office on Sunday morning, and we spent 4 hours drafting a cease and desist letter. She explained harassment laws and defamation while I typed everything she dictated. We sent it certified mail and electronically to Henderson's lawyer, documenting everything for the court file. The post came down within 12 hours, but the damage was done. Monday night, I finally sat down to figure out the rules about character evidence. Henderson's lawyer kept trying to bring up Leo's school disciplinary record and some old police report about his mom. I read through the evidence rules 5 times before they started making sense. Character evidence wasn't allowed to prove someone acted in conformity with that character on a particular occasion, with specific exceptions that didn't apply here. I drafted a motion to exclude Henderson's attempts to paint Leo as a troubled kid, citing 5 different cases where similar evidence were excluded. The research took until 4 in the morning, but when I read it back, it actually sounded like real legal writing. Tuesday afternoon, Leslie Reed called again, his voice urgent this time. Leo's guardian had gotten an eviction notice, and they had 30 days to find a new place. If they had to move to a different school district, it would mess up everything with the case and Leo's support system. Leslie had already started calling housing assistance programs, but most had waiting lists. We spent the rest of the day making calls, finally connecting them with an emergency rental assistance program that could cover 2 months while they figured things out. I documented everything for the court, showing Leo's need for stability during this stressful time. Wednesday morning, Derek called me down to the shelter for Mr. Slinky's routine health check. While the vet was examining him, Derek noticed something weird on his left ear. There was this small purple mark, like someone had used a marker, but when Derek looked closer, he could see the fur growing out white at the roots. The vet said it looked like semi-permanent dye that someone had applied maybe 6 to 8 weeks ago. Derek took photos with a ruler for scale and wrote up an official report about the discovery. This opened up huge questions about when Henderson actually last saw his ferret, since he claimed Mr. Slinky escaped just 3 weeks ago. Thursday morning, Aiden Russell showed up for his deposition at the courthouse, and I sat across from him with my borrowed legal pad trying to look professional. He pulled out a thick folder of technical documents about the microchip models Henderson claimed to use and started explaining how they worked. The chips were generic pet trackers sold at every pet store in the country with no unique serial numbers unless you paid extra for registration. Henderson never registered any chip, which meant even if Mr. Slinky had one, it could have come from anywhere. Why does Henderson care this much about getting back one ferret when he could easily buy another one? Something feels off about a rich guy spending thousands on lawyers and making Facebook posts about a kid who found a lost pet. Most people would just move on by now. Aiden drew diagrams showing how the chips all transmitted the same basic signal and explained that without prior registration linking a specific chip to a specific owner, they were basically useless for proving ownership. Henderson's lawyer kept objecting, but Aiden calmly continued explaining the technical flaws while I took notes as fast as I could write. By the end of the deposition, Henderson's main piece of evidence was completely destroyed, and I actually understood why. Friday's discovery hearing went better than I expected, even though the judge looked tired of our case already. She granted our motion to exclude most of Henderson's character attacks on Leo, but allowed his ownership documents to stay in evidence. Henderson's lawyer argued for 20 minutes about why Leo's school records were relevant, but the judge cut him off and said character evidence wasn't allowed for proving ownership. It felt like a partial win, which was more than I'd gotten in any other law school exercise. Saturday, I spent 8 hours walking around the neighborhood where Leo found Mr. Slinky, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had security cameras. Most people either didn't answer or said they didn't have cameras, but I kept walking and knocking. Finally, at this little bodega on the corner, Sandy Morales said she remembered that night because someone had parked weird and blocked her delivery truck. She had cameras on the alley where the dumpster was and agreed to check the footage from that week. Sunday afternoon, Sandy called and said she found something on the tape from 2 nights before Leo found the ferret. A white van had pulled up around midnight and someone dumped what looked like a small cage or carrier near the dumpster before driving off. The footage was grainy, but you could definitely see someone throwing something away. I drove back to the bodega and Sandy showed me the footage on her ancient computer in the back office. We watched it 5 times, and each time it got clearer that someone had deliberately dumped something ferret-sized. Sandy printed screenshots and wrote out what she saw while I properly notarized her statement using the notary at the pharmacy next door. I filed everything with the court Monday morning, following every single procedural rule Kelly had taught me. Tuesday, I was leaving the law library when this older guy in a golf shirt stopped me in the parking lot. He said he was friends with Henderson from the country club and wanted to talk about the case. He pulled out his wallet and offered me $2,000 cash if Leo would just drop everything and walk away. I told him that was illegal, and he laughed, saying it was just a friendly suggestion between reasonable people. I wrote down his license plate as he drove away and immediately called Kelly, who told me to document everything and file a report with the court about attempted witness tampering. The court clerk said this kind of thing happened more than people thought and gave me the right forms to fill out. Wednesday, Leslie called to say we needed to talk about Leo's mental health situation. He explained that Leo had serious anxiety issues that had gotten worse since his mom disappeared, and the ferret was basically the only thing keeping him stable. Leslie suggested we get documentation about emotional support animals, even though he knew it wouldn't carry much legal weight in a property dispute. We both knew it was worth trying because it painted a fuller picture of what losing Mr. Slinky would mean for Leo. Thursday, Leo's therapist wrote a detailed letter about his anxiety disorder and how the ferret helped him manage panic attacks. Leslie warned me the letter wouldn't change the legal ownership question, but it showed the stakes were higher than just a pet. I added the letter to our growing file of evidence, even though I wasn't sure how to use it yet. Friday night, I finally had time to really examine Henderson's photos of Mr. Slinky that his lawyer had submitted. Something felt off about them, so I started checking the metadata using a free online tool. All 20 photos were taken on the same day 6 months ago, not over several months like Henderson claimed. Even weirder, when I zoomed in on the high-resolution versions, the ferret in those photos had a clear scar across its nose that our Mr. Slinky definitely didn't have. Either Henderson was lying about when the photos were taken, or this was a completely different ferret. Saturday afternoon, I was loading groceries into my car when Henderson appeared behind me in the courthouse parking lot. He wasn't threatening this time, just standing there with red eyes like he'd been crying. He started talking about how lonely he'd been since his wife died last year, and how Mr. Slinky was all he had left. His voice cracked when he said the ferret used to sleep on his wife's pillow and still looked for her every morning. Part of me felt terrible for him, but then I remembered Leo clutching that carrier and crying in court. Henderson might be lonely, but Leo literally had nobody except that ferret. Henderson asked if I understood what it was like to lose everything, and I didn't know what to say. He walked away before I could answer, but his question stuck with me all day. That evening, I called Kelly for advice because feeling sorry for Henderson was messing with my head. She listened while I explained the parking lot encounter, and then reminded me that understanding someone's pain didn't mean I had to abandon my client. Leo needed this ferret for survival, while Henderson needed it for comfort, and those weren't equal needs. She told me good lawyers feel empathy, but don't let it override their duty to their clients. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table staring at all the evidence we'd gathered, and realized this case had become about so much more than just passing trial advocacy. Monday morning, my phone buzzed with a reminder about the procedural hearing at 9, the same time as my evidence class. I grabbed my notes and ran to the courthouse instead of campus. The hearing lasted 2 hours of arguing about discovery deadlines and document formats. My phone kept lighting up with texts from classmates asking where I was. During a bathroom break, I checked my email and saw the subject line that made my stomach drop. My professor wrote that missing today's class put me on academic probation, and I'd fail if I missed one more. I sat in a courthouse bathroom stall trying not to panic. Back in the hearing room, the judge set more deadlines I had to write down while my hands shook. When we finally finished at noon, I found an empty bench in the hallway and pulled out my laptop. I emailed my professor begging for makeup work and spent my whole lunch break outlining a paper on hearsay exceptions. Tuesday morning, Derek called saying he'd arranged a special visit at the shelter to document Mr. Slinky's behavior. Leo and I met him there at 10. Derek had set up a small room with cameras to record everything officially. He brought Leo in first, and Mr. Slinky immediately started making these happy clicking sounds. The ferret climbed right up Leo's arm and curled around his neck. Derek wrote notes about the ferret's relaxed body language and calm breathing. Then Derek had Leo step out and brought in 3 volunteers Mr. Slinky had never met. The ferret backed into a corner and wouldn't stop hissing. One volunteer tried to pick him up, and Mr. Slinky twisted away so hard he almost fell. Derek documented every reaction with timestamps and detailed descriptions. When Leo came back in, Mr. Slinky practically jumped into his arms. Derek's report filled 8 pages of professional observations about the clear bond between them. Wednesday morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Leslie. Henderson's lawyer had filed a civil suit against Leo's guardian for negligent supervision and emotional distress. The complaint claimed Leo's guardian failed to properly supervise him, allowing him to steal valuable property. They wanted $50,000 in damages plus legal fees. I read through the 40-page filing and realized I had no idea how to handle a civil case on top of the custody dispute. My hands were shaking as I called Kelly at the legal clinic. She told me to bring everything to her office immediately. I drove there with boxes of documents, trying not to cry. Kelly read through the civil complaint while I sat there feeling completely overwhelmed. She made some calls and within an hour had connected us with a legal aid attorney who specialized in defending families. The attorney's name was Marcus, and he'd handled cases like this before. He took over the civil suit defense while I stayed focused on the ferret custody issue. Working with someone who actually knew what they were doing made me feel less like I was drowning. Marcus filed a response to the civil suit that afternoon while I prepped for the next hearing. Thursday's status hearing started at 2 in the afternoon. The judge looked tired before we even began. Henderson's lawyer stood up first to complain about our delay tactics and frivolous objections. Then the judge pulled out a folder and started reading Henderson's social media posts out loud. He'd posted Leo's photo calling him a thief and asking people to report him to police. He'd written that I was a corrupt law student taking bribes. The judge's voice got harder with each post she read. Henderson's lawyer kept trying to interrupt, but she held up her hand for silence. She told Henderson that continued harassment could affect her final ruling and might lead to criminal charges. Henderson's face turned red, but his lawyer grabbed his arm before he could speak. The lawyer promised to control his client and stop all social media posts immediately. The judge set our next hearing date and warned that she'd be monitoring the situation. Friday afternoon, a courier delivered a package from Henderson's gated community. Henderson's neighborhood is sending packages now? This whole situation keeps getting stranger. First the country club friend with cash, then Henderson crying in the parking lot, and now mysterious deliveries from his gated community? The security office had finally sent their footage after fighting our subpoena for weeks. I spent hours going through boring video of Henderson's mansion entrance. Then I found something weird. The footage showed a ferret in Henderson's yard in January and another ferret in March, but they looked different. The January ferret had a white chest patch, but the March ferret's chest was all brown. Either Mr. Slinky had escaped way earlier than Henderson claimed, or he'd owned multiple ferrets. I took screenshots of both ferrets and added them to our evidence file. Saturday, I spent 6 hours researching ferret breeders online until I found one who'd been breeding for 30 years. I called and explained Henderson's claim about a ferret surviving the Titanic. The breeder actually laughed out loud. She said ferrets weren't allowed on passenger ships in 1912 because they were considered pests. She examined Henderson's bloodline documents I emailed her and said they were obviously fake. The dates didn't match up, and the registration numbers weren't in any real database. She wrote me a detailed letter explaining why the whole championship lineage was made up. Sunday night, I got an unexpected email from someone named Rakesh. He said he was Henderson's caretaker and had something important to tell me. We met at a coffee shop Monday morning. Rakesh looked nervous and kept checking over his shoulder. He explained that Henderson had gone to Europe for 3 weeks in December and left him in charge of the animals. Rakesh admitted he'd forgotten to properly lock the ferret enclosure one night after feeding. When he came back the next morning, the cage door was open. He'd been too scared to tell Henderson when he got back. Rakesh signed an affidavit about leaving the enclosure unlocked, which explained how a ferret could have escaped without Henderson knowing. Tuesday, the court ordered mediation before our final hearing. We sat in a small room with a mediator while Henderson's lawyer presented their settlement offer. Henderson wanted shared custody where Leo would bring Mr. Slinky to his mansion every weekend. Leo would have to stay there Friday through Sunday to care for the ferret. The mediator asked if Leo's guardian could drive him there, and Henderson said no. The child had to stay overnight. I pointed out Leo had school and couldn't spend every weekend at some stranger's house. Henderson said he'd hire tutors and build Leo his own room. The whole thing sounded insane and probably illegal. We politely declined, and the mediator noted we'd proceed to the hearing. Wednesday morning, 3 days before our hearing, the judge issued her preliminary rulings on evidence. She admitted Derek's behavioral observations as expert testimony and Sandy's security footage as relevant evidence. She excluded Henderson's social media posts as prejudicial, but warned him they showed his character. Our evidence was looking stronger than I'd ever imagined possible. The morning of the evidentiary hearing arrived faster than I expected. I wore the same borrowed suit, but this time I'd actually prepared real legal arguments. Leo sat next to me in the courtroom, his hands shaking as he held a folder of drawings he'd made of Mr. Slinky. Henderson looked calmer now, sitting straight in his expensive suit while his lawyer arranged stacks of documents. The judge entered and I stood up, my legs feeling weak but my voice coming out steady. Your Honor, the legal standard here is proving the identity of this specific ferret. I pointed to the carrier where Mr. Slinky was sleeping. Not who deserves him more or who can provide better care. The words came out clear and professional. Mr. Henderson must prove this exact ferret is the one he claims escaped from his property. I couldn't believe I actually sounded like a real lawyer. Henderson's lawyer jumped up to argue, but the judge waved him down. My first witness was Aiden Russell, the microchip expert who joined us via video link. He explained how the scanner model Henderson's lawyer used had been recalled for false positives. He showed documentation proving the chips Henderson used were generic ones sold at any pet store. Henderson's lawyer objected to the testimony being prejudicial. The judge overruled him. He objected again when Aiden explained the chips couldn't identify specific animals without prior registration. Overruled. 3 more objections followed about relevance and expertise. The judge overruled every single one, and I saw Henderson's lawyer's face getting red. Derek Hughes took the stand next, carrying a thick folder of observation notes. He explained in careful, neutral language how Mr. Slinky responded to Leo's voice versus strangers. He showed videos of the ferret becoming calm when Leo spoke, but agitated when others approached. His documentation included daily logs showing the ferret's eating patterns matched what Leo had described from their months together. Henderson's lawyer tried to argue Derek was biased, but Derek maintained his professional tone. The judge took notes as Derek explained ferret bonding behaviors. I introduced the security footage from Henderson's mansion next, showing 2 different ferrets in the enclosure over 6 months. Then I read Rakesh's affidavit about forgetting to lock the cage properly. Henderson's lawyer objected that this was irrelevant to proving identity. The judge considered for a moment, then allowed it, saying it spoke to the timeline of when a ferret might have escaped. I called Henderson himself for cross-examination, my hands sweating as I approached. I showed him the photos he'd submitted of Mr. Slinky, pointing out the nose scar in every image. Then I had Derek bring our Mr. Slinky closer to the bench. There was no scar on his nose. Henderson shifted in his seat. I asked about the metadata showing all his photos were taken the same day. He admitted he might have owned 2 ferrets at different times. His certainty about this being his specific ferret started to crack. He said maybe the scar had healed, but Derek testified ferret scars don't disappear completely. Leslie Reed testified last, explaining how Leo's school attendance had improved since finding the ferret. He showed records of Leo's grades going up and his anxiety medication being reduced. The judge leaned forward, asking specific questions about Leo's home situation and support system. Leslie explained the ferret had become Leo's emotional anchor. Henderson's lawyer tried to object, but the judge said she needed to understand the full context. After all the testimony, the judge called a brief recess. Leo grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. 20 minutes later, she returned with her decision. Mr. Henderson has failed to prove by preponderance of evidence that this specific ferret is his missing pet. She looked at Leo. The court awards permanent custody to Leo, with adoption to be formalized through proper shelter channels. Leo started crying and hugging me while Henderson slumped in his chair. The judge continued, ordering Henderson to pay court costs of $2,000. Then she suggested something unexpected. Instead of paying damages to Leo, Henderson could make a voluntary donation to the animal shelter. Henderson's lawyer whispered with him for several minutes. They agreed to donate $10,000, the amount Henderson claimed Mr. Slinky was worth. It let Henderson save face while helping other animals. Leo didn't care about money anyway. He just wanted his ferret. That afternoon, I submitted submitted my case file to my trial advocacy professor. She reviewed my motions, my witness preparation, and my courtroom performance notes. She confirmed I'd passed the class, but required a written brief about procedural lessons learned. I stayed up all night writing about proper evidence submission and witness examination. It was the best legal writing I'd ever done. 2 weeks passed while the mandatory holding period ran out. The shelter had to follow procedure even though the judge had ruled. Leo visited Mr. Slinky every day after school, bringing banana chips and reading to him through the cage bars. Derek made sure they had a private room for visits. Finally, the adoption day arrived. Derek handled the paperwork personally, waiving the usual fees because of the special circumstances. Leo signed his name carefully on every form. When Derek handed over the carrier, Leo started crying again. That afternoon, a card arrived at the shelter addressed to Leo. Inside was a picture of Henderson's late wife with a ferret and a note saying congratulations. We decided to take it as a peace offering. Leo taped the picture inside his locker at the school. The next week, Kelly Foster called me into her office at the legal clinic and pushed a stack of paperwork across her desk. She wanted me to work there next semester, said I had good instincts even if my paperwork skills needed work. We spent 2 hours going through my schedule, figuring out how to balance clinic hours with my other classes so I wouldn't fall behind again. She made me promise to actually attend my other lectures instead of spending every waking hour on cases. I signed the forms, and she handed me a key to the clinic filing room, which felt more important than any grade I'd gotten. Meanwhile, Leslie Reed set up a whole system for Leo, meeting with him and his guardian once a month to make sure things stayed stable. He got Leo into this after-school program at the animal shelter where Derek taught kids about pet care. Leo's grades started going up, and his guardian said he hadn't seen the kid this happy in years. Leslie sent me updates every few weeks about how Leo was doing, always with some story about Mr. Slinky's latest adventure. The biggest surprise came when Henderson's lawyer called to say his client wanted to meet. I showed up at this fancy restaurant expecting another fight, but Henderson looked different, calmer somehow. He told me about his wife, how she'd loved animals and always wanted to start a rescue. Henderson's lawyer keeps objecting to everything even though the judge overrules him every time. Something feels off about their whole legal strategy here, like they're just throwing stuff at the wall hoping something sticks instead of building a real case. He was starting a ferret rescue foundation in her name, dropping all the civil suits, putting real money into helping abandoned ferrets find homes. His lawyer slid over the paperwork showing they'd already filed the non-profit status. Henderson said losing the case made him realize he'd been trying to fill a hole with the wrong things. He even asked if Leo might want to volunteer at the rescue once it got running, though I wasn't sure Leo was ready for that. 3 months passed and everything felt different. I was working real cases at the clinic, actually helping people instead of just stumbling through classes. My grades went up because Kelly made me study properly instead of cramming at 3 in the morning. Leo sent photos of Mr. Slinky every month, usually dressed in tiny sweaters his guardian helped him make. The ferret had gained weight and looked happy, sprawled across Leo's homework or riding in his backpack. Sometimes Leo wrote little notes about school or his new friends from the animal program. I kept every photo in a folder on my desk. One afternoon, my trial advocacy professor stopped by the clinic and asked if I understood why she'd assigned me that case. I thought about it, about how I'd gone from not caring to fighting harder than I'd ever fought for anything. She said sometimes the cases that seem ridiculous are the ones that teach us why law matters, that it's not about the money or prestige, but about standing up for people who need someone in their corner. Looking at Leo's latest photo of Mr. Slinky wearing a tiny birthday hat, I finally got it. Sometimes the weirdest hills really are the ones worth dying on. Thanks for hanging out with me and poking around at all these questions. Always fun to wonder through this stuff together. Catch you next time. And hey, like the video, it helps more than you think.